Recently, I had a couple of conversations with people working in climate policy, and they were feeling discouraged. They felt that there's a lot more pushback on climate policy, that there are less funds available, and that some initiatives are either cancelled or scaled back substantially. But in this episode, I want to make a case for climate optimism. And not because the pushback isn't real, but because there has been a big win in climate policy in the last decade. And that win is that there's a great increase in carbon coverage and carbon pricing. So in this episode, I will tell you that you can probably be a bit more optimistic than you currently are for three reasons. First, the total emissions covered by a carbon price is increasing. Second, the global average carbon price itself is increasing as well. And third, there are dynamic effects that are going on, like EU CBAM regulations, that are only going to further encourage carbon coverage. So in this episode, we are going to dive into the reasons for these trends. I'm going to cover what's happening, why it's happening, and then also kind of give you a couple of insights you might not be aware of. Now, for those of you who are more the glass half empty type, I will also provide some caveats at the end of the episode if you want to keep a gloomy outlook. So let's dive in. So let's start with the coverage of emissions by tax or emissions trading system. In 2016, according to the World Bank, global carbon taxes and emissions covered around 12% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So about 1 in 10 of emissions was covered. But in 2026, according to the World Bank, so only like 10 years, we now cover 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions. That is a big change. It means that now we are very close to 1/3 of global emissions being covered by some form of a direct carbon price. Now, immediately, I need to be careful. The fact that it's covered does not mean that it's strongly priced, and we will get to that in a second. And of course, there's also 70% that it's not covered. But it does mean something huge already. It means that those 30% emissions are inside a system, that there's monitoring in place, that there's reporting, that there's verification, that there's a compliance obligation that firms or people have to meet. And so there's an institution now that can be adjusted, tightened, and expanded. And in climate policy, that matters a lot because the first step is often not getting the perfect carbon price. The first step is building the machine to do so. Because as we saw in episode 11 with Jos Beke on the EU ETS and episode 8 with Kaushik Deb on the ETS in India, it can take quite a long time to set up an ETS. And it can require a lot of political capital. You got to get the firms on board, you got to get people on board. But here's the thing, once the systems are in place, they can then be more easily expanded. And the world has built much more of the carbon price machinery than people realize. So what is behind the expansion? So one of the big reasons behind the expansion is that China and India, who together around 40% of emissions in 2026, have started to implement an ETS. So China's ETS came into effect 5 years ago in 2021, and India only just launched its ETS for carbon last year in 2025. So that's very big and very exciting. In addition, there's also been other developments. For example, Japan's ETS has entered its mandatory phase. Vietnam has an ETS in effect, and Brazil and Turkey are also preparing policies for upcoming ETS programs. Now, this is also where you should be a bit careful because these new systems are often not very stringent in the beginning. For example, China was using an intensity benchmark rather than an absolute cap. They may rely on free allocation. They may be focused on first just getting the industry on board, like with the EU ETS. But that's often how these institutions begin. And as we discussed with Jos Beke, there's a lot of learning by doing in the beginning phases, and then you gradually ramp up the stringency. And I think that's one of the underappreciated lessons of carbon pricing. Weak systems naturally can become stronger once the things are in place. It's not automatic, it's not inevitable, but it can, and there's a very clear path. The second argument for the win is that carbon prices have gone up. After all, just because you covered something does not mean it will have a big impact. That also depends on the carbon price or the cap that you've set. Now, the World Bank reports that the average carbon price across implemented carbon taxes and emission trading systems has roughly doubled over the last decade. It has gone from $10 per ton of CO2 in 2016 to nearly $21 in 2026. That is a 100% increase and quite a strong level change too. Now, again, I don't want to overstate this. $21 per ton is not a very high global carbon price if you look at the estimates from the literature. There you get estimates between $100, $200, even like $280 or more. So if you compare it to like some of the estimates of the econ literature, we're not there yet. But on the other hand, I also don't want to undersell the importance of a $21 carbon price. Because as we saw with Edwin Woodman in episode 25 of the podcast, kind of relatively small carbon prices like $21 can still have big impacts. For example, in the EU, despite kind of these low EU ETS carbon prices, emissions decreased substantially when the ETS was implemented. And one of the reasons is that your abatement will also depend on the abatement curve. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you have a lot of coal plants and you have like a $21 tax in play, a lot of these plants might switch from coal to natural gas, which is kind of something that happened in Europe in the last 30 years. And then you just get a big decrease in emissions just going from coal to natural gas. So it's not necessarily that because the price is low that you cannot get big initial impacts. That kind of depends on how does your abatement curve look like. Now, we've covered increase in emissions, we've covered increase in price. Now, what's behind it, this increase? So let's go there. So we've seen that emission coverage has increased a lot. Now, the main driver behind the increase in coverage is emissions trading systems. A carbon tax coverage, the other option, has actually stayed relatively stable at around 4 to 5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So the big expansion of coverage has come from emission trading systems. Now, if you've listened to other episodes, you know I'm a big fan of emission trading systems, and their coverage has tripled since 2016. So the global carbon pricing story is not primarily that the world has, adopted carbon taxes. It has that the world is adopting emission trading systems. And if you take the Econ 101 class of environmental economics, you kind of get the result that they can both get the same reduction target, they get revenues, and you can redistribute them back to people. That's kind of the environmental Econ 101. Of course, there's the famous paper by Marty Weitzman that there's a lot of, things about the uncertainty and what you can get there, and that's all true. But I think in reality is that a carbon tax has the word tax in it. So it makes it often very politically difficult to implement. For example, the European Union tried it in the 90s and it failed because it couldn't reach the unanimity required. China's Ministry of Finance originally proposed a carbon tax in 2010 and tried to implement that. It failed. And I think you could kind of just see why. There's often a great public outcry that happens when gasoline prices go up. For example, you had it in France with the Yellow Vest movements. It's like a gasoline tax or a carbon tax is so visible, it's very easy for people to organize around. And even now with the war in Iran, gasoline prices have gone up, and now politicians are talking about subsidizing gasoline. On the other hand, emission trading systems can be more complicated mechanically. You've got to set a whole system in place of like caps, you got to allow firms to trade. But in some ways, I think that complexity makes them politically easier to implement. Also because if you put the ETS generally on like the most polluting firms or the power sector, price increases in those industries are often harder to see for consumers and organize themselves around. For example, if your electricity bill goes up by 4%, it might not be clear to you that that might be happening because of an ETS, for example. In addition, what I really think is happening with ETS is that they provide a gradual path for increasing the stringency. Like we talked about with the EU ETS. In the beginning, there was a lot of free allocation for industries. And then over time, we moved away from grandfathering to auctioning. Free allocations were reduced, caps were tightened. And that was actually the main topic of my episode 25 with Edwin Woodman, where really a lot of this stuff, once you've got it in play, you can then organize it such that it becomes gradually more stringent. And so also you can get industries on board, which is like the big lesson that Kaushik Depp in his episode gave away. It's the fact that you can get industries much more easily on board. Now, again, this does not make emission trading systems perfect. Like we've seen with the EU ETS, as energy prices have gone up, there's been more debate about the caps, the targets, and so on. But I do think they're a lot more durable than a carbon tax. Because even a final point that I want to make is in episode 16 with Professor Jeroen van den Berg, we talked about the cap and trade versus carbon tax when people are basically not fully rational. And his main paper was that cap and trade is much more robust to behavioral biases. And I think that's just another strength because it's just like an institutional thing that just goes by itself. Now, we've talked about carbon coverage, we've talked about carbon prices, we've talked about why ETSs are getting more into play. Now, let's talk about the third reason that you can be very optimistic about the future as well. And that is the development of the EU's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or in other words, CBAM. In terms of direct emissions coverage, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism is quite small. But politically, CBAM may have a much larger effect because it basically tells foreign exporters to Europe, if your product is carbon intensive and if there is no equivalent carbon price paid at home, you may face a carbon cost at the EU border. In other words, if you bring a good into the EU, you get it taxed similarly as EU firms. And that changes incentives because now governments see that their firms have to pay this Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism tax, and the revenue goes to the EU. Whereas if the foreign government implements its own ETS, then the revenue just goes to the foreign government, not to the EU. So the tax to firms remains the same, but foreign governments can recover a lot of this tax money so that it doesn't go to the EU. And governments generally just like having more revenue. So this is, I think, a very good incentive. And then once other countries like China and India increase their own ETS, like say $10, that makes the cost to the EU of this unilateral kind of carbon tax much, much lower because you get less differentials in costs and thus the carbon leakage problem becomes lower. And who knows, then maybe China and India might implement their own carbon border adjustment mechanism for other countries. So you can kind of get to the dream of Nobel Prize winner Bill Nordhaus, where you can kind of get a climate club of countries implementing a carbon tax. And if you want to hear more about that, I recommend the episode with Kim Clausing in episode 18, where we kind of talk through the dynamics of that in more detail. I have presented a case for why you could be more optimistic about climate change and climate policy. In other words, you need to look a bit further than the EU and the US, especially like China, India. There's really big developments happening, but also like in Japan, Turkey and Brazil are looking forward to the future to implement ETS. So these are great signs. Now, obviously, I promised you caveats. Well, the first point is, we've only covered 30% of emissions. So that means that 70% of emissions are still not covered. And that often includes, like in the EU, like sectors that are generally harder to bring into ETS, like agriculture, transport, like housing. So those are generally industries that are very hard to get into the ETS. But there's promising news there as well, is that the EU is working on the EU ETS 2 that is trying to cover some of those industries. Now, finally, political durability is also not guaranteed. China, India might go back. Carbon pricing can be reversed. So, it's not because it's harder to change that it's not changeable. Also, as I mentioned, the carbon pricing isn't the highest yet, but I think there's a lot of good signs that might go up. I think another good sign there is that China might be switching from a intensity benchmark to an absolute benchmark. So that's very positive. But as such, then we need to see that those, what those climate caps are. Cap by itself isn't going to do anything if it's not very binding. So the whole goal of this episode was to try to show you that you might not be very positive or optimistic about climate change or climate policy, but I think this episode tried to get you to be a little bit more optimistic than you might be currently if you look at it from a global perspective and from a carbon coverage and carbon pricing point of view. And I think those developments are very promising, and I really hope that in a decade from now, I can do the same episode giving you much, much better numbers still. So on that note, thank you for tuning in. I hope you have a great week. If you have any comments or notes or anything, just let me know in the notes. Send me an email, contact me on LinkedIn. And otherwise, I hope this has brightened your day a little bit. So thank you for tuning in, and see you later.